In this video, I'm going to be talking about Foxhole, the game. It's going to be a sort of short overview over what my views are on the game as a whole. I know that there are quite a lot of other people that have made videos like this, and mine's going to be a little bit different because I have a lot of different perspectives on this game that a lot of people don't share. So I'm just going to walk through my point of view on the game, where it is currently, and how I'll give it like a sort of glimpse and how I approach the game and how my regiment approaches the game. I will be following this video up with a bunch of other videos talking about strategy and tactics and whatnot. But for this one, I'm going to try my best to keep it short, which is something that I found very difficult to do. For those who have watched my previous videos on other games, I usually uh, take a long time to go into things because I like to discuss things in depth. I don't see the point in trying to just scratch on a topic just a little bit and just be like surface level discussion. If we're going to talk about something, might as well just talk about it, discuss it, and use our brains to actually like think about what it is that's going on. So that's what I'm going to do here in this video. So as it is marketed and described on Steam and its own webpage, it's a massive multiplayer online persistent warfare game. Now, the MMO part here, a lot of people sort of like disagree, and not a lot of people describe this game as an MMO, but it really is if you just look at it from the the way that an MMO, what it means. It's massive multiplayer online. Most people think Warcraft, World of Warcraft, or games like traditional RPG games, really, but they don't have a monopoly on the word MMO. Massive multiplayer online. That pretty much sums up what Foxhole is. You take part in a game where you play with a lot of people. It's all multiplayer, and it usually numbers. If you're talking about a war in Foxhole, that number can go up into the thousands. So that's pretty accurate description. And the persistent warfare part, what this means is that when you play the game, after you log off, the game doesn't stop. It's continuous and ongoing, and it's carried on by other players who are playing the game. So if you log off and go to sleep, while you're sleeping, fellas in a different time zone and different region of the world who just got off work or back from school, they're logging on, and for them, the war day for them is just starting. So this is the persistent warfare aspect. Now, wars in Foxhole, they can take anywhere from a couple of days to a month. I believe the longest war at the time of the recording of this video is about 42 days, and the shortest war was about 2 days, I believe. So that's the kind of like time frame that you're working with here for a single war or a single quotation mark game or match in a traditional sense. That's the overall aspect of Foxhole, and that's how I believe the developers, not only how they marketed it, but that's how they've sort of designed the game. That was their basis for it. And so far, everyone has gone along with just this, basically. They've talked about and treated the game just on this basis right here, that you're just one player in a massive community that's taking a part in a warfare game kind of thing. But my perspective on it is a little bit different in the sense that my background in gaming is from the tabletop perspective. And what I found is that Foxhole actually has a lot of elements of a war game in the traditional sense and in the more strategic sense. Hopefully, by the end of this video, I'll be able to fully explain and get this idea across. So, what makes a game a war game? It's usually a game about that has conflict involved and involves strategy. That's one of the more mainstream definitions of a war game. And I put here the commercial versus the professional because some people get confused with this term as well. The professional term for wargaming is usually used by the military or businesses, and the professional war game is a simulation, basically. This is not what we're talking about. The Foxhole is very much a commercial war game, and it's made for fun, basically, made for people to buy, play, and have fun. It's not a simulation of anything, and it couldn't be a simulation because the game itself isn't really based on anything real. There are certain aesthetic and yeah, basically aesthetic elements that the developers have stated that they drew from the Second World War, but the entire war itself, the entire weapons that are used, they're all pretty much fictional for the most part. So it's very much a commercial war game. But one of the main elements that's how I define a war game is that it takes a lot of time to plan and prepare to play the game. And usually in a war game, the time to plan and prepare exceeds the time in combat or the time to actually play the game. Uh, that may sound very weird to people, and for those who are more casual, come across this and that statement that I just made, probably thinking to yourself, there can't be such a game. that can't be possible because who would want to do that? But if I just show you the list here, oh, not this, but the next slide here. Yeah, here. These are the sort of games which uh, most people are familiar with the first three, but not the last three. But these games, if you think about it, the amount of time that it takes to prepare to play a match of Warhammer on a tabletop or any other kind of miniature war game, it will exceed the time that it takes to play the game. Because you have to take the time to plan out your army, you have to build the army both physically and on paper in terms of like the force composition that you want to take onto the battlefield against your friend that you're going to play the match against. These are all certain elements that make up a war game, and which I identified that is one of the core sort of aspects of a game that makes it a war game, basically. Um, so yeah, I've got to double back here because I've skipped the slide. But yeah, that's the kind of like broad definition of the war game that I'm going with here is that it takes a lot of time and effort to play the game properly, right? We're we're approaching the game in the sense that we want to win because nobody really likes to lose, and I don't like to lose really. So it's sort of like I usually approach my games in sort of like a competitive kind of mode, and majority of people do because nobody likes to lose. I mean, let's face it, that's just human nature. So if we're trying to approach the game from a normal perspective, like if you're playing a normal game like a sport or any other kind of game, computer game, the objective is to win, then you're going to have to take a little bit more time and effort to think out what it is you're doing if you want to effectively play Foxhole. Now, the one unique thing about Foxhole is the scale of the game compared to the list of war games which I just showed you a glimpse of, which I will be going more in depth in the next slide. It's the next slide after this. Is the unique aspect of Foxhole is the scale. You basically only have control over your one player character in the game, unlike in more traditional war games or any other kind of war game in the sense of a strategy conflict game, like a RTS, for example, like in StarCraft or Company of Heroes, or even games like Civilization. You're not in control of entire armies. You're not in control of an entire economy. You are just one person that is limited by the tools available that your one character can handle. Now, if you take a step back from that, however, and you look at it from a larger perspective, you then start to see elements of a strategy game like Company of Heroes or StarCraft or Civilization. Right now, with the 1.0 update, logistics has taken a larger role in Foxhole. Now, whether the facility system took the game in a better or worse direction, that's a huge debate that is currently going on. I have my own thoughts on that, which I will talk about in another video. But we're just going to talk about the game as it is and not how we want it to be or how we wish it to be. if you do take the step back and look at Foxhole, you then start seeing the elements, as I said, of a strategy game and a war game. Now, just to address the second point here, which I probably should have put in the previous slide, the MMO aspects are still present. Unlike in an MMORPG, your skill sets and skill trees, they're not bars which you put numbers into to max out that give you certain abilities or certain buffs and whatnot. But experience and skill is a very real factor in this game, which not a lot of people, I think, really appreciate or, or illustrate or emphasize in discussions about the game. Skill and experience in this game is very much more player driven in the sense that it's the player who gains the skill and experience, and it's not something that you can measure with a bar or a checkbox on a name of a skill or anything like that. If the player takes part in a operation or a firefight, he then starts learning more about the game. And as he progresses in the game, if he plays the game even more, he will become adept at certain things that others aren't. For example, there are a lot of players that I know that just do tanks for the most part, and they're very good at tanking. But if you take them to do artillery, most of the time they've never even touched an artillery piece. Whereas on the other hand, you could find somebody that just does pure artillery. Same with logistics players. There are some players who have played the game that have never been in a firefight before. They just purely do logistics. They ship equipment to the front and they manage and build facilities. These are all things that are present in the game. You can like sort of specialize in an area and learn a lot of things, and you can always at any time branch out and learn the other mechanics of the game. So this is the MMO aspect that's more familiar to MMORPG players that a lot of people don't pick up because it's not something that is part of the game design per se. It's just something that happens to be part of the game because of the aspect of the massive war that goes on, basically. Yeah. Now, the third part here, I'm going to be discussing the aspects of the wargame list, which I listed out, and show you how Foxhole has the majority of the aspects of commercial war games that are not MMO related, say. So we just go out to here. So I already touched on the miniature aspect here. So matches for Warhammer or bolt action, they require a lot of time to prepare the army physically most of the time. For those who have ever played FFG's line of games, you will know that for these games, the miniatures they come pre-painted for the most part. Some of them have to be assembled and painted, but it's not a big part of the game like Warhammer. But in FFG's games, the force composition part is it's a much larger plays a much larger role. Basically, you have a lot of different options and abilities that you can bring into the game, and you have to pick and choose basically what it is you want to bring onto the table. Now, the elements here that I find in Foxhole that are relevant and similar is as I said, the force composition and the combined arms element. Because if you tried to play Warhammer, let's say, with a single miniature in a full game, it is possible because there are certain units where it's just a single miniature that is overpowered to some extent. You might be able to get away with playing an entire game with just a single miniature against an opponent who has a lot more and still win. Uh, I know I'm exaggerating a bit, but there are those who have played Warhammer who are still playing Warhammer. It's not a very balanced game, and sometimes this event does occur. But what I'm trying to get at is if you try to play any of these games with just a single unit on the board, you won't get very far. That's just because of the nature of the game. You have more elements to it. And if you try to play these games with a unit, but just that one type of unit, for example, let's say in Warhammer, you decide to bring an army of just tanks. If your opponent knows what he's doing, you can get a unit to counter all your tanks, and you're done for, basically. It's the same with all the rest of the games here that I've listed out. If you try to play with just one core unit, whether it be tanks, infantry, or just pure artillery, it's very easy for your opponent to counter you easily. Combined arms plays a very big role in war games like these, and also in the rest of the war games listed here. But miniature war games, they illustrate and portray it much better. Well, not better to say, but it's more pronounced because of the scale usually of war games like this. So force composition and combined arms. In Foxhole, if you were to, and I've seen this many times, if you were to just run an entire force on just pure tanks, you find that you're not going to be that effective, and usually you end up losing most of your tanks because the enemy very easily either has a lot of infantry with anti-tank weapons or artillery as well. And what that can do is strip away your infantry support. It's a little bit more complex than that, but like the point I'm getting at, combined arms and Foxhole is a very important element. And a lot of veterans, they know this, and they know all the examples of where a large force of just one type of unit of some kind just gets absolutely destroyed and makes no gains. It happens, and I've been a part of battles where that has happened. So yeah, the traditional war games that I've listed here, these are hex and counter war games. So the rule books for these usually very easily could reach to like 50 to 100 pages. They're very long, very tedious. As I've said before, one of the aspects of war games which I identify is the time and effort it takes to prepare and plan to play the game exceeds playing the game. And that's definitely illustrated best in these type of titles that are listed here. Now, these aren't the only games that are miniature war games or traditional. These are the ones that I'm familiar with and most other people are familiar with. But in traditional games, the aspects of these games that are present in Foxhole for the most part is the command and control and the morale elements. Now, in traditional war games, these are usually tables with arbitrary numbers that are abstractions of the mechanics that they're trying to portray. So for command and control, for example, you just roll a dice, and that will determine what your army can or cannot do. For example, whether how many of the units in your army, whether they can or cannot move, and that's there to try to simulate the problems in like fog of war, communication between long distances and between units in the heat of battle, how well that they can coordinate cohesively and cohesively act in a battle. That's the command and control elements. And the morale elements, this is also present in some of the miniature games here. Usually, if a unit takes a lot of losses, you then roll a dice. And if you roll low enough, that simulates the off chance that a unit will break because they've taken a lot of losses, they're demoralized, or the command and control elements that I've talked about earlier, maybe they're destroyed and they can no longer effectively operate in the battle. Now, these are the aspects that are more pronounced in traditional war games like these titles here listed than the miniatures. And all these aspects for both miniatures and traditional are all present in Foxhole. So if we continue here, for the most part, as I said, everyone has focused on the MMO and the persistent warfare. And with the update of 1.0, the majority of the community has focused almost purely on tactics and logistics. Logistics now almost purely meaning facilities, because as I've said before, I'm not going to go again into the debate, but it now takes a lot of time to get the logistics rolling in Foxhole. And this is what the majority of the videos or the discussions revolve around. What I'm trying to get at here and convey is that there's actually a lot more depth in Foxhole than what people are led to believe. The strategic level, which quite frankly, from what I've seen, hasn't been developed. And the reason why the strategic level hasn't been developed, what I think why it hasn't been developed well, is because of these two. Now, if we go back here, I guarantee you that everyone who is now watching this video and looking up these titles, they've never heard of these games before, and that's because these are not easy games to get into, really. Uh, these games actually do kind of border on the professional side because these are more simulation type games. Unconditional Surrender here is a Second World War, all-encompassing in Europe kind of war game, and Empire of the Sun is the Pacific theater. The Great Battles of History series, they focus on they focus on the ancient, I believe, all the way up to I think probably the 18th century, somewhere like that time frame. So they focus on more historical, but they all have elements that are more simulation than fun aspects. I mean, these games still are commercial products, but they're geared towards the more hardcore strategy gamers, war gamers, basically. And so, as I was saying, the command and control and morale elements, those are very, very important in Foxhole. And you can't get the strategy done unless you have these two sort of figured out for the most part. You can't strategize on a strategic scale if you don't have any units to command and control, basically. At this point in time, most of the strategy in Foxhole evolves around mass assault. Try to get as many people as possible into one region, and you try to get as much equipment and weapons and ammunition into that region and hope for the best. And there's nothing wrong with that, because if you're trying to approach the game from, like I said, a war game, you're going to have to take a lot of time and effort to try think about and plan it. Now, most people now probably about to be typing out in the comments, well, this is all good and well in theory, but the only reason I've started making the videos now is because I've had enough experience in Foxhole, and I've had plenty of experience playing all the other previous types of war games which I've described. And I know for a fact that if just a little bit of time and effort was spent into thinking out this, it is very much possible to play Foxhole like a traditional war game. These elements here in terms of command and control and morale, these can all be addressed if we just took a step back and opened up the discussion. And that would allow for the strategic level of Foxhole to start developing. Because right now this is completely lacking. And right now I've established a regiment which is trying to play the game a little bit differently. And we're very much focusing on not only the tactics and logistics, but also the strategy, the command and control, and the morale. Now, just to before I finish off the video, the morale aspect. The morale aspect actually plays probably the most in Foxhole. It is the most prominent and the most important, and yet it doesn't. The discussion around it hasn't quite been developed in the community, but it is something that is known, but it's not discussed in a way that a typical war game treats it as. Right now, the community treats morale in sort of like a uh, how do I say? The biggest discussions usually revolve around burnout. So basically, people who get fed up with the game, the monotonous gameplay, the facilities, and the logistics. This usually then leads to players to stop playing the game, and this is a very, very bad thing to do. Well, not to do, but I mean it's a very bad aspect of the game that is currently being more common. But but if we set that aside a little bit, if we try to focus on playing the game and try to win, morale is important because you need to make sure that your units and your regiments, and this plays very closely with the command and control. If your regiment has a lot of members and they start to burn out, you lose combat effectiveness. Because as I've said, you can't play the game just by yourself if you want to be effective. You're going to need a group of people together. And if your group fractures and breaks, then you lose your cohesion, your command, and then you won't be able to play on the strategic level, as I've said. I will go more in depth into the morale in later videos and how this connects with strategy and tactics. But for the most part, I hope that I've gotten across the message that Foxhole plays more like a war game as one of the war games that I've listed out in the previous slide here, and not so much so as typical other kind of a game like Call of Duty or League of Legends, or in the MMO aspect like World of Warcraft, um, RPG games like that. So yeah, thanks for watching.